Hello, I'm James Dart, co-founder of Inspire You and Yes I Will Vote, and welcome to the 5th episode of Remoaner Telling Our Story series podcast. On today's episode, we have Matt Kelly, the founder of the New European newspaper. In this episode, we talk about the issues with the toxic right-wing pro-Brexit press, as well as founding the New European, what it did back then during the campaign and what it's doing now. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Matt.
Hey, James, how are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Thank you so much for doing this.
You're more than welcome.
It's great to have you on the show, on the Remoaners Telling Our Story podcast series. I always say this a bit of a tongue-in-cheek title, but with the idea of unpicking what a Remoaner or Remainer is, which we'll come to later in the episode. So thank you very much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Fab. So just tell me very briefly, not that this is easy to do, but who is Matt? Talk to me a little bit about your, early days and then your sort of journalistic career before we get to the New European. Talk to me a little bit about your backstory there.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a journalist. I'm from Liverpool. Before journalism, I spent a couple of years working on a fairground in Southport. Cool. Decided that wasn't going to be a sustainable living. So I moved into journalism, thinking that would be a sustainable living. Well, that's probably more challenging than fairgrounds. And I spent a lot of time in local journalism. I worked a paper called the Formby Time for a while, where I sort of started out. Then I graduated to the Liverpool Echo, and then onto the Daily Record in Glasgow. And then finally I came down to London and joined the Daily Mirror, where I did a number of jobs. I wrote a technology column. I became features editor. I then went off to develop the digital side of the business. And I left the Mirror in 2012. A guy came in who I didn't see eye to eye with, and he was made my boss. So I thought it was a good time to bow out after 18 years. And then I joined a Spanish newspaper design agency called Catas and Associates. Okay. And then had a great time spending a couple of years mainly in Argentina, working for a big newspaper there called Clarín, and sort of doing their digital transformation. My wife then got pregnant, so I had to spend less time gallivanting in South America and more time at home.
Yeah.
And joined a company called Local World, which was again a local media business. That got sold to Trinity Mirror. Sorry, this is getting very technical. That got sold to Trinity Mirror in 2015, and then I joined a company called Argent, which is where, after 6 months of being in Argent, we launched the New European.
And that was, in about 2 minutes, your life story.
Yeah, I hope that kind of didn't sound too convoluted, but yeah. So I've had a lot of fun jobs, and, but none more fun than the one I'm in now, I have to say.
Yeah, which we'll come to in a moment. So I wanted to, because obviously you set the New European up, and the New European is quite different to most of the other newspapers out there, at least to my and if throughout the course of this I sound like a novice in this, that's because I am. So, and I suspect a lot of the people listening to this may also be. So maybe that will work. But for me, the New European it stands out because it does look different. It has a campaigny vibe, but we'll come to that. So what were you doing on the day of the referendum? Because obviously you were still working as a journalist at the time. Yeah. You were at the Mirror, were you at the time?
No. So I was at Argent. I was at this local, and Argent's a local media company based in Norfolk. And they've got 70 or 80 newspapers and magazines all over the country. Yeah. And that was my job, was chief content officer of Argent. Local media is a very challenging sector right now. So I had plenty on my hands there. Yeah. But on the day of the referendum result, I was walking around London, kind of where I live, fairly bemused and shell-shocked, I think, like most people were. And I had a meeting in Shoreditch with a mate of mine. We were talking about, how awful the media had been, really, and how the media had contributed, I thought, to what had happened. And then I was sitting alone in a cafe called the All Press Cafe in Redchurch Street. And there were a couple of Italian baristas there, and they were talking amongst themselves about, what does it mean? They have no idea. I was sort of listening to this and I thought, my God, this is just how bad this has got now. That we've got very cosmopolitan London, where people like to come from all over the world, but especially from Europe. And, we're so dependent in the city for Europeans, that just to make life tick. And it was one of the things that I loved about London, was how varied and cosmopolitan it was.
Yeah,
and
of
here
course.
they were talking about, can we still stay here and stuff like this.
Yeah.
And I thought, I got really quite angry, with not so much with people who voted Brexit, but angry with people like myself, really, who hadn't done enough, evidently hadn't done enough to try and, win the argument. But I did think also, because I'm a journalist, I did think there's an opportunity here, which is, never in my lifetime had there been such an obvious constituency of people who all had one name, the 48%. They were all angry and bemused about one thing. You knew where they were because of the different ways the country voted. And there was nothing there to represent them, how they felt, exactly how they felt. So I emailed my boss, a guy called Jeff Henry, and said, and it was a bit of a blithe email because I was expecting him just to sort of laugh it off and say no chance. But I emailed him and said, if ever there was an opportunity to launch a new national newspaper, it's now. And I'm not talking about in 3 months' time. I mean, now. And like I say, I wasn't expecting a response, but Jeff emailed back and said, well, let's talk about it at our executive meeting next week. And so on the Tuesday, we had this long, gloomy exec meeting about all the downsides to Brexit, how we were going to get our newsprint, and price of ink going up, and advertising slumping, and all of these things that have come to pass, by the way. And I completely forgot about the idea of the New European until Jeff said, has anybody got any positive, constructive ideas? And looked at me. And I went, oh, yeah, I thought maybe we should launch a new national newspaper.
Right at the end.
And
any other business.
And to my sort of surprise stroke kind of horror, people sort of warmed to the idea, the guy that was less enthusiastic was the chief finance officer, who just saw a huge loss in the offing, And so the real clever moment I had, which I still sort of blow my own trumpet about, was I looked at this guy, Brian, and said, why don't we just do it for 4 weeks? We'll call it pop-up publishing. We'll do it for 4 weeks and just see how it goes. And if it bombs, then we can just cancel it, without any real embarrassment. And I saw the guy's shoulders relax, and he thought, how bad can it be?
Yeah.
And so everyone agreed. And then the miracle of newspapers is that 8 days later, the New European's first edition was on sale.
Really?
In 20,000 newsagents around the country.
Wow. 8 days it took.
Yeah, because, if you've got, people always talk about digital being agile and, the new medium. But the truth is that newspapers are very easy to produce if you know what you're doing. And if you've got distribution networks, and if you've got access to printing presses, designers, journalists, all of this. Whereas websites actually can take a lot longer to produce. But, we proved the model, and the first edition went out and sold nearly 40,000 copies at £2 a copy, without any marketing promotion. So I knew we were onto something. And
zero marketing at all.
Nothing.
Really?
I mean, even if we had the money to spend on marketing, which we didn't, we wouldn't have had the time to create a campaign or to do anything. The only publicity it got was me racing around talking on as many sort of TV shows and radio shows as I could about the New European newspaper. And that in a way, because it was a newspaper, it was part of its success, because people thought, this idea is so stupid that we'll get the guy on to talk about it, so that's the marketing we got. And for what is it, 4.5 years later, I think we're issued 230 now. It's still going strong. It's making a small profit. But as you know, we've got a lot of new investors now, some really serious people who believe that it's got a much bigger future. So
we'll definitely come to the future a little bit at the end. But so just to take you back a little bit then. So the day of the referendum, the day of the referendum as opposed to the day after, were you were you going flat out to try and push the Remain cause, or
No.
as a journalist, did you at that time were you allowed to or were
No.
you trying to be objective?
So the local newspapers that I was in charge of, part of their kind of editorial position was that they weren't politically engaged. They weren't partisan, and there's a great argument to be made for that, which is, give the readers the facts and the information, but let the readers decide. And that's still true of a lot of local newspapers. But I do think that if we could, if we had a crystal ball and we'd have seen what was going to happen, I think we would have been a lot more vigorous in just presenting the downsides to Brexit, which are huge, as we know, and as real today as they were back then. So no, I wasn't running around trying to whip up the Remain vote. I didn't see myself as politically active in that, to be honest. I was a spectator. It wasn't until it happened that I really felt engaged. And I think that's true. I'm just being honest. I think that's true of a lot of people. It was part of the problem. But it's possibly also one of the few upsides to Brexit is that a lot of people now do realise how fractured the country is, the arguments that need to be won and haven't been won, and that you do have to be active, and you can't be complacent like the Remain campaign was. Well, I mean, I think the Remain campaign goes beyond complacency, to be honest. But if you want to know how to campaign and get your way, unfortunately, you've got to look at the opposition. You've got to look at Nigel Farage and the Brexiteers.
Very cynical campaigning, though, isn't it? It's almost anti-politics.
Yeah, but relentless. Relentless. And sadly, it went unchallenged, really, by a Remain campaign that was, grossly smug, complacent, and ineffective.
Yeah. What would you say when you first started the New European? Would you have called yourself a campaigner? Do you call yourself a campaigner now?
No.
Okay.
I call myself a reader. I edit that paper for myself. I try and give us a sense of optimism and forward looking, but I like a laugh. I like it to be cheeky, insurgent. I like it to. I like it to make a bit of noise now and again. I don't want it to be, just something that exists and people are ambivalent about. I'd sooner people hated it than had no view about it.
I totally with you on that. Yeah, you've got to ruffle some feathers sometimes, haven't you?
For sure.
And there's certain people you want to ruffle feathers.
100%. And I think that's one of the problems with the mainstream media is that in the past, their readers have been such a broad constituency that, in their view of Europe, that they didn't know which way to turn. The Guardian's readership is 50% Brexit, 50% Remain. Believe it or not,
I didn't know that. Wow. Okay. Wow.
The Mirror's readership is exactly the same. So the Mirror sells as many copies in the northeast of England as it does in the northwest of England, and they have totally different outlooks on Brexit. So, if you're the editor of the Daily Mirror and you decide that you're going to go wholeheartedly for Remain and you're going to campaign as hard as you can. And by the way, I've been on the inside of those campaigns when the Mirror campaigned against the Iraq war, for instance, like absolutely high impact journalism that had a real effect.
Yeah, for sure.
But if you do that with a cause that alienates half of your readers and you lose a chunk of readership these days, that's a sacking offence. You're going to lose your job and you're going to lose advertisers. And newspapers these days, legacy newspapers, are not in a position to throw away 5-10% of their readers. They face an existential threat in their finances. So I do sympathise with the people who had to steer a course, for the sake of keeping their business going. But that wasn't a problem I faced. My problem was just how quickly could I convince Remainers that, this was the title that really was going to dig into the Brexiteers.
Yeah.
And the only way you can do that is is with a lot of kind of chutzpah and humor and be prepared to piss a lot of people off, which is we've been very successful at over these last years.
Yeah. I mean, to a certain extent, the New European is the New European not preaching to the converted in a way.
Yeah.
So that although you're going to be pissing some people off, the people you're pissing off are not likely to be reading it in the first place, are they?
Well, no, they're not. Although increasingly, I think as the New European has evolved into something broader, which it has to do. It's not, if it's just going to be a single issue newspaper, then we would have closed it down 3 years ago.
Yeah.
But it has broadened into something I think much more interesting and relevant, and brings to life a lot of good stories across Europe. So it's becoming of more interest to people than people who would today describe themselves as rejoiners. I mean, we very much hope that at some point in the future, Britain will re-engage with the European Union in a structured way, but it's not going to happen soon. And there's a lot of stuff we can do in the meantime. So I think the longer we go on, we will be attracting readers who are not your typical, the people who we were marching with in London, against Brexit, will be a broader appeal. And that's fine. That's good for business, and it's good for the Remain cause actually as well, because it means that we are in dialogue then with people who aren't the choir, And I think it's very important. We've been very shouty in the past, and indulged in ranty polemics. And I think
to an extent, you were the you were holding the banner for a whole community, weren't you? I suppose so. You weren't. I guess at that stage, maybe. I mean, you tell me, but I get it came across to me as you weren't necessarily trying to persuade the sort of wobbly middle or Brexiters. You were trying to be the standard bearers for a community. But now you're saying you're trying to broaden them, and you are trying to be a bit more persuasive and bring people in a little bit more.
Well, I think it's it's inevitable and it's essential that and also it's boring to just be that guy in the corner of the pub who's just saying Brexit shite all the time. We know that.
That's true.
We know that, and it's getting to the point where it's unhelpful.
Yeah.
Now that's never going to stop being part of our DNA, but equally, I think it would be great if people could listen to what we're saying on fact-based journalism, where we're specific about reasons that Brexit's shite, and start being a bit more constructive about how we can make it less shite. That would be good.
Yeah. So just talk me through very quickly the sort of the road, as it were, the evolution of the New European, because it started out as this pop-up, then it wasn't a pop-up, and it was coming out, and it was doing very well. But in my head, there were certain milestones, like there were certain people you brought in. I remember, like, you brought Alistair Campbell in, and he seemed to have a big effect, brought a lot of kudos to the paper. I mean, were in your mind, are there like 4 or 5 milestones where you would say this is how the New European can be sort of
I guess so. I think, the first issue, everybody thought it was going to be a load of rubbish because it was done by this local newspaper outfit in Norwich, so of course it was going to be crap, and it would be full of the press association copy that everyone got. And so I was determined, obviously, for my own reputation, that it wasn't like that. And one milestone was calling a guy called Jonathan Friedland, who many people will know, who works at The Guardian, but I had been his editor at The Mirror when The Mirror was going through that anti-Iraq phase, right? So all of these circles come round at some point. And Johnny's a friend of mine, very kindly agreed to write that week's lead piece. So from day one, we had some credibility. It wasn't just a bunch of press association rubbish, right?
Yeah.
And then, as you say, you said we brought Alistair in. Alistair sort of brought himself in.
Okay.
A bit of a force of nature, and sort of phoned up. I think it was week 3 or 4. Phoned up and said, what the hell are you guys doing? I said, well, we're trying to stop Brexit. And he said, well, so am I. I want to be part of it. And ever since has been, a great friend of the New Europeans. And anybody who knows Alistair, whatever you think about him, he is utterly sincere, and I've never met a guy with a stronger work ethic. And he's, he is relentlessly. Well, when you speak to him, obviously he has times, but when he's him, he is relentlessly positive about what can be achieved, and that is something that has been, well, I can't state how helpful that's been. Then I guess the next big thing for us, and this was partly down to Alistair Campbell, was, and this is an interesting story, this, because Alistair got us the first, Tony Blair's first kind of piece about Brexit. And Blair wrote this very strong piece. I remember the headline, we ran a big chunk of it as a huge headline right across the front page. And it was all about how we're the insurgents now. It was a very powerful piece. And I think anybody who listens to what Blair said about Brexit, it's all absolutely true and spot on. However, people hate Tony Blair. They loathe him. But so the weird thing about that issue was that was the issue that got us media coverage literally across the world, from the States to Peru to Moscow. It was all about, this is what Tony Blair has now said about Brexit, and he said it in the New European, and every UK newspaper covered it. So we were on the radar, and yet that was our lowest selling issue of all time.
Really?
Yeah, because honestly, no one would pick it up in the newsagent because people hate Tony Blair.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what he says, they hate him.
I had the exact, obviously, I don't know if you know too much about what I do, but I was in charge of running a lot of the social media for the Remain groups, the grassroots groups, so some of the national pages as well. And I would share a lot of Tony Blair's interventions because they were very powerful. He's a very persuasive guy, and he's an intelligent bloke. Yes, he's incredibly divisive, but I always had a second, like, before I shared, I was like, have I got the emotional energy to moderate the comment section of this post? Because I know it's gonna just be chaos now. I'm gonna have thousands of comments. I'm gonna have to go through, hide, block, try and, you're right, it's divisive, but his interventions are incredibly powerful, and he is a really well-known figure. So
that's right.
But it is weird that people wouldn't pick it up.
No, I mean, it was like, you could have like published a picture of a steaming turd on the cover and you'd have sold more. It was like toxic, so it got us a lot of attention, but no sales that week. However, in the long run, I think it gave us a lot of credibility and a sense of importance amongst journalists, which is, it's actually very important, I think, because journalists talk about journalism, in public forums. So it's a good route towards relevancy, is to get journalists to talk about it. And then I would guess the most important milestone in the New Europeans history after that would be the sale, me purchasing it from Archon. The title over the last 3 or 4 years has carried on doing fine. We've had some really good stories. We have some fantastic front pages. We've got a great art director called Chris Barker who worked for us freelance, and he's such a clever guy.
Your front pages are brilliant. I often just share screenshots of your front pages on social media because they're just so powerful. Great.
So I mean, most of that is Chris. I can claim the odd bit of credit, but 85% of it's Chris these days, and he's been a terrific asset for us. But it's a really small team, and it's been under-resourced because the truth is that national newspapers are not Archon's game. Archon's game is trying to survive in local media, so they were never going to throw a lot of money at something like the New European. And so the moment when it's, we've arrived at, which is where there's a bunch of people, and like I said earlier, some real serious heavyweight media people, some very heavyweight tech people and venture capital people have all got behind it and have given us some money to go and realize its potential. I hope, I think hopefully you'll see, if we have this conversation again in a year's time, we'll be talking about a paper that is in a different place, and is really getting talked about.
I have a quick follow-up on this, is because there was a Brexit version that was basically the same as yours that was launched, wasn't it? I think it was it by the Brexit Party that launched it?
Something like that, yeah.
But I don't see it in the shops. What happened to that? Do you know?
Well, it was crap.
Yeah.
It was rubbish. it was crap, so it went out of business. As these
Okay. Is that
crap,
literally the reason? It's just
as crap things do. Yeah, they tend to go out of business. And you know, the myth about the New European has been that, you know, it's funded by the European Commission or something like this, and
yeah.
or it's, you know, as some shady, you know, organization paying for its undoubted losses. But it's never made a loss. You know, it's always watched its face. It's always paid its own way.
Yeah.
And it's never had any real advertising to speak of. So even though it's a shoestring operation, that shoestring has been paid for every week by people buying the paper. And to me, that's the best kind of publishing model you can have. It's, you know, it's a good way to do business. Is if you've got people who enjoy your product so much, they're going to pay you a decent amount of money for it. And the funniest, best or the worst remark, depending on what mood I'm in, I get these days is when people tell me that they don't read it anymore, but they'll never cancel their subscription because they just love the fact that it's still there and it drops through their door on a Thursday, you know. So I've got to get them to open the bloody thing. There's lots of great journalism in there, and it's not just all about Brexit.
For sure. Let me ask you about identity. So I ask this to everyone. Matt Kelly, are you a Remoaner?
No, I'm a Scouser. I'm a Liverpudlian first and foremost.
Okay.
I'm a European second.
Yep.
And I'm, you know, I'm British, and I do see those things as distinct, as never more so than today, actually. And I think, you know, I was very proud that Liverpool voted to remain in such great numbers, because to me it was a demonstration of common sense, actually, and not of, you know, of nationalism. And I've always considered myself lucky to have come from Liverpool because it's got such an international cosmopolitan outlook. And it's renaissance these days. And if you haven't been to Liverpool in the last decade, you know, it's a fantastic place to go. I describe it as the San Francisco of Europe. You know, it's absolutely wonderful. And that is in no small part due to the funding and the intention that it got from the European Union. So you walk around Liverpool and you see lots of blue plaques saying paid for by the EU, you know, and it was in a serious state. And you've got to remember that Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe were seriously discussing how to run Liverpool down as a city, you know, just to empty it, close Liverpool, because it was seen as such a dead loss. And now it's a wonderful, vibrant, economically buoyant place. So yeah, I don't see myself as a Remoaner. I think lots of people would point at me and say, you're Remoaner in chief, you know, but I just think that there's something negative about that. It's a label that was given to us by Brexiteers. Trust me, Brexiteers aren't in the business of trying to do us favors. So you can work on the basis that it's bad. And I think I have been a Remainer. I was certainly one of the 48%, but I think we've got to look for a new way of thinking about ourselves now if we're going to be effective about deepening the ties with Europe.
When you say we, do you mean?
I mean people who I mean the Remainers, you know, people.
Okay, so the community at large.
Yeah. I think, you know, the 16 point whatever it was million people who voted to remain. Well, many of them care less about it than I do, and are ambivalent. Many of them will have been converted to the idea of Brexit. But the same is true for Brexiteers who will be alarmed at some of the stuff they've read and are now hearing about. And I do think it's to stick to labels that were accurate in the weeks after the vote is a missed opportunity, you know, and you don't want to pigeonhole yourself with a label that gives people the opportunity to stereotype you, you know. That's not helpful.
No, for sure. I ask it because it was a label that was used against us, and I always found it a weird one because for me, a Remoaner was always just somebody that cared deeply about their country and had a particular view on Leave or Remain. And it was always I always found it, well, it doesn't sound like an insult, because all you're saying is that I'm using my democratic right and my voice to challenge what I perceive to be a really negative thing for our country. So,
Yeah.
and we've had some people say, yes, I'm a Remoaner, and some people say no. So, but I want to ask you specifically, what is it about the European Union as opposed to Europe? Because I've had a lot of people who say, I love Europe, I'm a Europhile, I love the values of Europe, the architecture, the languages, the food, or whatever. But I don't like the institution of the European Union. So what is it about the actual European Union as an institution that gets you sort of to wake up in the morning to want to defend it?
Well, I don't, in truth.
Okay.
I don't. I happen to think that the European Union needs an awful lot of work. I think it's a very flawed institution. I think people look at it and think it's not, if that's what democracy looks like, it's not the kind of democracy they want. And I think the European Union and especially the Commission too often gives people the excuse to accuse them of being arrogant and smug and aggressive, and occasionally, as we saw in the vaccine thing, just plain stupid, and bureaucratically inept. So by no means do I leap out of bed and say, how can I convince people about the greatness of the European Union? However, I do think that when people say, but of course we're still in Europe, there's something deeper than that. There is something, of course we are geographically, but there's something much deeper about European progress that the European Union represents, whether it's flawed or not. And I've never been a European federalist. I don't believe that is desirable or beneficial. But I really do believe that, never more so than now, in a community as globalized as it is, and with threats from obvious commercial and cultural growth boom in the Far East, in China, in America, that not being part of the world's biggest trading bloc and not being at the table to influence its development just seemed to me like the stupidest thing you could wish for. To cast yourself away from that on the hope of forming alliances with people thousands of miles away. I read the other week that we're now engaging in the Pacific Rim Trade Organization, and the last time I looked, we were firmly embedded on one side of the Atlantic and very far from the Pacific. So, the logic that we would spend energy and resources trying to get a trade deal with Peru and cast aside trade deals with 22nd European nations just seemed plainly nuts to me.
Yeah.
And and it was all formed on, we talked earlier about the faults of the Remain campaign versus the way that the Brexit campaign fought. And the Brexit campaign understood that in a battle of heart and head, it's the heart that will win. And I think we argued for the head. We argued in fact, and we forgot the emotional damage that a lot of things have created in parts of this country, and have been pinned on the European Union, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah.
We made some mistakes. Tony Blair made a lot of mistakes in his anticipation of how immigration would play out in this country, for instance. And then we didn't pay enough attention to people who were saying, our village, our town, its identity has been completely changed.
Yeah.
And it's not the place I grew up in, and it's not the place I was hoping my kids would grow up in. Yeah. And we were too quick to label that as racism, when actually these people have a point. Totally and Westminster did bugger all to address those things.
It's a hard one to get right there, that balance there, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you really want to make the case for immigration. You don't want to allow the Nigel Farages to occupy the narrative, but at the same time, you also need to be fair and be like, if every other shop now is in Arabic or in Polish or something, and this has only happened in the last 10 or 15 years, you're going to feel like you're going to feel like an alien in your own country, and that's scary, and that was never never on anyone's manifesto, was it? That
No, and I get that, and I think the biggest challenge we've got to, and this is for everybody, and these will sound like very kind of easy words to say, especially from an organization that's been part of the noise, but we've really got to start listening a bit more and shouting a bit less. We've got to take pains to understand what's going on in the country at large. I think the fact that the United Kingdom is on the point of disintegration, that's a huge challenge. If you're in Scotland and you're torn between, believing in the United Kingdom as an entity and also wanting the best chance of rejoining the European Union, that's a huge dichotomy for you. And those things need exploring. The regional progress of the nation, infrastructure in communities that have been neglected, and all sorts of pushed under this northern powerhouse nonsense. It's like there's real challenges in big parts of the country that Westminster doesn't even know about, never mind is formulating solutions for. So all of this stuff about leveling up, well, there's a huge task at hand there, and it's not made easier by Brexit. But it is what it is, and we can't just keep throwing our hands in the air and shouting liar, liar at people. We've got to, they're liars, but we've got to try and either expose it or find a way to move forward constructively as a nation. And you touched on it. The biggest fallacy and the biggest lie in the whole thing is that people who have a belief that we're better being at the table of the European Union are somehow unpatriotic. That's nonsense. I'm as patriotic as anybody. But my belief is that Britain's self-interest is best served with an outward engaging philosophy rather than an insular philosophy,
Yeah, totally. And it's that classic internationalist versus nativist, which is largely dominated the Brexit the debate, really. And I've just and that's still the case today, because sadly all the Eurosceptics, actually I won't ask this question, I'm going to ask a different one because I prefer this one and I realize we've only got a bit of time left, but talk to me, because it's rare that I get an actual journalist to talk to me about this stuff. It's usually just amateurs talking about this in my circles. But talk to me about the state of the British press at present, because I mean, I've tried to read into this. I watched the Murdoch documentary series, which scared me. Obviously, Andrew Neil's setting his new UKIP TV up. Three billionaires own a majority of the British press. You guys are doing your thing, but is the British press and also the fact the British press is the least trusted anywhere in Europe? I think that was polling from a few years back. What's going on with the British press? Is it just that there are right-wing billionaires who have just got a total dominance over the discourse in this country, or is there more nuance to that? Tell me, why is there so much Euroscepticism? I'm asking more than one question here, but why was Euroscepticism so easily embedded in these papers
well, I mean, it is more nuanced than it's just some sort of three guys with a hotline into Downing Street and telling people what to think. However, there is a lot of commercial self-interest at large in the media, and those, it would be a mistake to think that Rupert Murdoch doesn't have his political opinions, articulated on the front pages of his newspapers. But editors tend to do well when they are editing by conviction and they resonate with enough people to make a great circulation story. And I think the best example of that, in all the wrong ways, was Paul Dacre, at the Daily Mail. You've never had a greater conviction editor, I think, on the planet. And you've never had a newspaper that resonated quite as strongly as it did with such a large number of people that, described as Middle England. And so I think rather than looking at, Rothermere, who owns the Daily Mail, it was Paul Dacre who drove that anti-immigrant, anti-European agenda. That was latched onto by the editors at the Daily Express, who saw the Mail's success with it, and so because they were less smart and had fewer convictions, thought cynically, oh, we can latch onto that. So you had the Express fall into line. The Telegraph has always been Eurosceptic and kind of insular when it comes, old British kind of sentiment. You had the Times. No, the Times wasn't as Brexity as it could have been. The Sunday Times was likewise a Remain title. I think I'm right in saying, and the Mail on Sunday was a Remain supporting title under Geordie Gregg, who is now the editor of the Daily Mail.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. If you want to know the truth, I think it's less conspiracy and more cynicism. It's cynical exploitation of how people think, and the willingness to be as partisan as they can get away with.
So is it pandering to the worst instincts of people? Is that kind of the idea here? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Paul Dacre's Daily Mail wanted to scare people, make them afraid, make them fearful for the future, that we were somehow under invasion, that tomatoes were going to give you cancer, that you were going to get stabbed, or your car was going to get rammed off the road by a Polish lorry driver. It was the worst examples to support their case and then exaggerate it. So, and they got away with it. And the problem with the Daily Mail is that the BBC Today programme would read it and think, this is so in touch with the British public that we can't ignore it. And so that started to help set the BBC's agenda as well. So it bled in. The left was much less good at being that kind of vocal and voluminous. And I think the problem with left-wing progressive media, like The Guardian, for instance, or the Daily Mirror, is that they're much more inclined to demonstrate all the sides of the debate. I mean, The Guardian used to have this feature called Bubble Buster, where they would present 5 or 6 stories that day that were from right-wing media, just to make sure that you know what the other side's talking about. You're not just listening in your little bubble. It's inconceivable that Paul Dacre's Daily Mail would ever give an ink to an off-message opinion. They are relentlessly on message. Now, I think you're going to see that erode. I think it's already eroding at the Mail under Geordie Gregg. Although, Geordie Gregg's a Remainer, and I think he's a good progressive journalist, but even he won't switch the political stance of the Daily Mail, because
he's a slave to the base, isn't he?
You're a slave to the reader. That's the truth.
Yeah. And
so it becomes this sort of cycle, this circle of self-fulfillment, where you scare the reader gets scared and wants to read more to palliate that fear, and it's a very vicious circle.
So would you say, on a psychological level, maybe at a sort of subconscious level, that the drip feeding of Euroscepticism, the fear mongering that came out of these papers, I mean, I would say a lot of the time it's just propaganda. It's not objective journalism or anything. I know you've got to go very shortly, but
no, it's fine. Keep going.
Okay. Would you say that that because I did an episode of this with my mum and dad, because they both voted Brexit. And my dad's a builder. He's a Sun reader. And my mum used to buy the Daily Mail. They don't anymore, and they're very embarrassed that they used to buy these papers. Now that we've sort of discussed it in more detail, but they basically said, "Do you know what, James? We were completely wrong to vote for Brexit, and the reason we kind of voted for Brexit was just purely emotional and purely down to the fact that we didn't even read the articles. It was just the front." It was the headlines, often the headlines. 40 years of reading these headlines are just like the EU is bad, the EU is evil, the Romanians are going to come live next door.
Yeah.
And they just subconsciously, I think they kind of accept that now. They just subconsciously just sort of soaked that up over many years. And when they went to vote, it was based on that really, and not much else. And they kind of now say, we sort of realize that now, and we're sad that we were manipulated in that way.
Yeah. I agree completely. And what I've said in the past is that it was almost like Pavlov's dog. You know, it was like the incessant, repetitive bringing down and into disrepute of immigration and European politics, or even the Mickey taking of Jacques Delors and stuff like this in the Sun. That sent it built up to the extent that when the referendum came, all they had to do was ring that immigration bell, and everybody started salivating, and it was like yes, and it had become part of a lot of people's not just belief system, but actual, certainty of how the world was formed. And here on a plate was their chance to stick it to the establishment who had put them in this position for so long. And that's exactly what happened. You've got to remember that our Prime Minister worked for the Daily Telegraph as Brussels correspondent, and wrote lies. Pure lies, just concocted nonsense about bendy bananas being banned and stuff like this. I mean, this guy is now our Prime Minister, and people look at it and it's almost become as though because he's a known liar, people have stopped worrying about it, and he gets away with it all the time now. The man is an inveterate liar, and was part of the problem about just making lies up from Brussels to get copy in the Daily Telegraph. And here we are, and the guy's the bloody Prime Minister. How does that work? It's like a sick joke.
It is. And I come from a teaching background. I was a teacher before I went into politics. And the stuff that we tell kids every day is be honest, fight the good fight, don't lie, all the good stuff you would want teachers to. And I used to be there thinking, why don't I just tell them to go to Eton, lie for a living, go to dinner parties and make a load of contacts with billionaires, and that's a much better way to live your life, because that's how you get success these days. Don't bother being a good person and having integrity and blah blah blah. It just feels like the people at the top are the antithesis of everything that I, as a school teacher, was trying to instill in young people, and I feel that's a really sad.
It is
reflection of where we are. Yeah,
it is. I've got 3 kids from 6 to 15, and they all know that Boris Johnson's a liar. So, I hope that kids are more alive to listening and thinking about politics now than maybe even we were when we were kids. I don't know. I hope so.
Yeah. Shall I probably should let you go then. It's 10:02.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's been a pleasure. Just very quickly before you go, is there one thing, a message that you would give the Remain community, or the 48% or whatever? Is there a message of hope, or what we should be doing, how we should be mobilizing?
Yeah, subscribe to the New European.
Of course. Yeah, I thought I should have said that myself, shouldn't I? Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Matt Kelly, thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Bye-bye.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed that. Next week on the show, we have Sue Wilson, the chair of Remain in Spain. In this episode, we talk about why Remain was set up, what its objectives were in the early days and what it's doing now. Also, we talk about what the situation is for British citizens living in the European Union today, after Brexit, and what the implications of the Brexit deal are for those who may now wish to move to Europe to study, to live, to retire. I hope to see you then. Thanks so much.